Welcome to Pambazuka Podcast. Today we are talking about money, specifically whose money, who controls it, and what it means for Africa's future. Our guest is Ndongo Sama Sylla, the co-author of the fantastic book Africa's Last Colonial Currency, the CFA franc. Ndongo is a Senegalese development economist. He is currently the Africa Regional Director of the International Development Economics Associates, or IDEAS, an organization that brings together economists from the Global South. Previously, he held the position of advisor to the President of the Republic of Senegal. He is the author and editor of over 20 books published in many languages, and I'm so happy that they get translated to languages that I speak. And his work covers topics such as fair trade, labor markets, democracy, money, and finance. Dr. Sylla authored The Fair Trade Scandal, Marketing Poverty to Benefit the Rich, published by Pluto Press, and as I mentioned, also published a book about the CFA franc story, and he is the co-editor of Economic and Monetary Sovereignty for 21st Century Africa, published also by Pluto Press in 2021. And most recently, published as well Revolutionary Movements in Africa, an Untold Story, and he is the editor of Imperialism and the Political Economy of Global South's Debt. His latest co-authored book is French Neocolonialism in Africa, A History of Electoral Imperialism. Pluto Press as well. It seems like Sylla is friends with Pluto quite well, but also I appreciate their contributions, and our friends have published with them too. And lastly, Dr. Sylla is one of the initiators of the Conference on African Monetary and Economic Sovereignty, the third edition of which was held in October 2024 at the African Union. More of a personal opinion, his appearances and critiques and writings spark a much-needed conversation about the continent's financial independence. His argument is both simple and radical. Africa doesn't need just a simple single currency. What it needs is the ability for its countries to trade with each other without using dollars, euros, or relying on a relic of French colonialism. A mechanism to stop bleeding foreign currency reserves to pay for things it could be financing itself. But we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. Right now, Senegal is in the middle of a full-blown political and economic crisis. A hidden debt scandal has revealed that the country's public debt is not 74% of GDP that was officially reported, but closer to 132%. The International Monetary Fund has frozen a $1 billion lending program. The President and Prime Minister, once inseparable allies, had a very public falling out over whether to restructure the country's debt or to seek alternative paths. And at the center of all of this sits a man named Ahmadou Al-Aminou Lou, a former head of Senegal's branch of the Central Bank, or the Central Bank of West African States, who has just been appointed Prime Minister in what looks like a clear signal to the IMF and international creditors. All of this raises an uncomfortable question. How does a country with a supposedly sound economy end up with a $7 billion in a hidden debt, and who knew about it? What role did the IMF, the World Bank, and the French Treasury play in enabling the situation? Why are most economists calling for debt restructuring rather than demanding accountability for who's responsible? And what does any of this have to do with the CFA franc, a currency whose very name, until 1958, stood for Colonies Français d'Afrique? As we'll explore, these are not separate issues, they are all interconnected. They are the same story told from different angles. It's the story of a financial architecture designed to keep African countries dependent on the dollar, on the euro, and on the IMF, and the former colonial powers that still hold the strings. So, to start us off, we want to get an understanding, thanks to the presence of our guest, about what is the CFA franc. So before we get into it, into the details of your kind of proposal that we'll speak about later, can you explain to our listeners, Sylla, in plain language, what is the CFA franc actually is, and why it's so controversial, and why do critics call it French monetary imperialism?
Thanks first for having me. It's great to be invited to this podcast. The CFA franc is a currency born in 1945, in December 1945, so after World War II. Since its creation, 1945, the main principles organizing its management have remained the same principles. You have four basic principles. The first is that the CFA franc is pegged to the French currency, and the French currency used to be the French franc until 1999, when it was replaced with the euro. The second principle is the free movement, of capitals and incomes between countries using the CFA franc and France, and between the two CFA franc blocks, because we have two blocks of CFA, two blocks of countries using the CFA franc. The third principle is what is called the convertibility of the CFA franc, meaning that the French treasury will make sure that every time people, the two central banks are short of foreign exchange, the French treasury will provide a foreign exchange. That means its own money. For example, if the Central Bank of West Africa that is issuing the CFA franc West Africa is short of CFA franc, is short of euros or dollars, the French Treasury, the Minister of Finance of France, could lend to that central bank the amount it needs in terms of euros. You see, but there's a counterpart to that, and the counterpart is that the French Treasury is represented in the organs of the central bank. That means that any major decision has to be approved by the French Treasury. So that means that there is a legal tutelage over the CFA franc, exercised by the French Treasury, but also since 1999 by the Eurozone political and monetary authorities, because there have been agreements signed between France and the Eurozone political and monetary authorities saying that important decisions like the decision to devalue the CFA franc, the decision to accept a new member in the CFA franc have to be, they have to be sent for prior information to the Eurozone political and monetary authorities. So since 1999, we could say that there is a double legal tutelage over the CFA franc zone, exercised by the French government and also the Eurozone political and monetary authorities. So we have two blocks, Central Africa, 6 countries, West Africa, 8 countries, using two currencies with the same acronym, but different, denominations.
And so if one then looks at the case of Senegal particularly, a lot of people were happy in the elections of 24 with the turnout. Turns out to be that Macky Sall, who had a long history of abiding by the diktats of the French colonialism and neo-colonialism in Africa, but particularly also I remember in 2021, and this is very tangential, when there were protests taking place against the government, and such that much of the country relies on using the telecommunication services by France, given the fact that he was being attacked by the protesters or is under pressure by the protesters. France decided to cut off the communication inside Senegal, which shows even that there's communication dependency in Senegal and much of Western Africa. But today, when we bring it up to particularly what happened last month, Senegal is in the middle of a big kind of economic crisis that arguably the biggest it has seen in decades. A hidden debt of at least 7 billion has been uncovered, which is, I'm interested in this notion of what does a hidden debt mean. The IMF has frozen its lending program. The president prime minister had a fallout, and now you have a new prime minister, Ahmadou Al-Aminou, who comes straight from the central bank. What does this tell us about the choices Senegal is facing, and what does it tell us about the power dynamics at play? And also, if you want to explain a bit what exactly happened between 23, 4, and 5 up to the present.
In fact, since let's say March 2021, they have been, moved by the former regime, Macky Sall's regime, who was loved by the West, etc., to prevent the political rise of Ousmane Sonko. Ousmane Sonko is a kind of, let's say, patriotic nationalist leader who is, committed to reclaim, the economic and monetary sovereignty of Senegal. And this was the first time in the history of Senegal that we have a political leader committed to that. And so this created a huge challenge for the neo-colonial system. And so Macky Sall did his best to prevent Sonko from being a candidate. And ultimately, Sonko chose his best friend, who is also a tax inspector, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, to become the president of Senegal because Sonko was so popular. He was prevented from running, but he chose his best friend. If he had chosen another Senegalese, even if that Senegalese was not known, that Senegalese would have become president. That is his level of popularity. You see, but during this period between March 21 and March 2024, at least 60 people have been killed, and in Senegal, generally, we have very peaceful protests, and we are not used to people being killed during, peaceful protests. But such were the stakes, and Macky Sall, was, given a kind of green light by the West because they don't want Sonko to come, especially given what happened to the Sahel. Because in the Sahel, you had 3 countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where you have, anti-imperialist leaders. They come from the military, but they hosted the French troops, French military bases, and try to, redraw new relationships, with France, the West, etc. And so France did not want to lose Senegal and also the West. So Sonko posed that challenge. That's why Macky Sall was given the license, to do all what he did, during this period with, more than 60 people killed, especially the young people who were demonstrating peacefully. But, you were talking about, this internet, disruptions organized by under the regime of Macky Sall. Sometimes it lasted 5 days because most of the demonstrators, they would use their mobile phone, their mobile connection in order, to coordinate, etc. So they cut that in June 2023, because the main company, of telecom is controlled by the French to some extent. But the French have done more than that. In the case of, for example, Mali and Niger, they asked the central bank to cut the government access to its own bank accounts in order to organize a kind of financial, blockade, against the country. That means, domestically speaking, the government has no longer access to its own bank accounts. And the central bank refused to refinance, its own banking system, despite its mandate, of financial stability. And even France, pushed countries like Senegal, who are heavily dependent on their trade with countries like Mali, to implement a commercial embargo with landlocked country. A landlocked country such as Mali. Mali lost, and we also lost, you see. So that means that under Macky Sall, they had many things that the French did against the Senegalese people and African people, generally speaking, and they feared Sonko. And now during that period, they were also very complacent. They gave a lot of loans to the regime of Macky Sall, and they were celebrating what they called Africa Rising, the Plan Emergence, as they call it in French. But in fact, I have been writing a lot saying that this is kind of a fake economic growth because it only benefits extraverted interests, including the local, elites, and also it is based on a sustainable, external debt building up. And I have been writing on that since 2019, 2020, saying that we'll have a debt crisis because the thing is, when you take loans in foreign currency, for those loans to be sustainable, to be reimbursed, they have to be associated with projects that will deliver hard currency. That means US dollar or euros, or at least that would save existing, foreign exchange reserves, because you would produce things that would replace your imports. But that had not been the case. Macky Sall used these loans in order to build infrastructure projects that corresponded to demand coming from the imperial centers, and that did not deliver the hard currency. So the dynamic with those loans is that what you will have a growing debt service in foreign currency, while your export, income will stay flat, and that's what happened. And I have been writing, or to say that we will have a debt crisis. Now, this hidden debt crisis is an aggravating factor because most of those debts are in domestic currency. That means the loans that have been taken by the Senegalese government, towards the CFA franc, monetary system, banking system. You see, so technically speaking, no debt could ever be hidden, because when we talk about debt, we are talking about dual relationships, creditor and debtor. So if the government took loans, it took loans from the banks. So the banks were aware of that. You see, so when we talk about hidden debts, it is just to say, from a technical point of view, that the parliament was not aware of that. Because when you are in a liberal democracy, in a kind of republic, every spending you make, every loan you make, you have to be approved, by the parliament, initially or a posteriori, and that did not happen between 2019 and March 2024. There have been many loans that have been taken without Parliament's approval. You see, so the Senegalese people were not aware of those debts. And the international financial institutions, they also say that they were not aware of those debts. But I adapt that. I think they were aware of those debts, but they wanted Macky Sall to win. And so they decided to become, let's say, complicit in that situation. I have no concrete evidence, but that's an assumption I would make. And some economists from the IMF have been also making that claim, that these so-called hidden debts could not have happened without the knowledge of the central bank, of West Africa, issuing the CFA franc in West Africa, without the French Treasury, who has a legal tutelage of the central bank, without the IMF, World Bank knowing it. You see, so we have all of this mix of people. And the interesting thing is that you talked about the new Prime Minister, Al-Amin Lo. He used to be the national director of the central bank in Senegal. So he's the number one defender of the CFA franc worldwide. And, when he was appointed General Secretary of the government first, we were all shocked to see such a guy appointed, because how could you say that you are a kind of a nationalist, I don't know, you are for sovereignty, etc., and you would appoint as the Secretary General of the government the most ardent supporter of the CFA franc? Something must be wrong, But that guy, when he was appointed, he said, I was aware of the hidden debts, and I wrote to the Macky Sall's government to tell them to take the right measures. That's what he said first. And afterwards he said, we were not aware, we have been cheated. So, these people are not very credible. But now that we have this scandal, the thing is how we are going to solve it. And now they have appointed, Al-Amin Lo, in order to salvage the situation. When I say salvage the situation, because those who, for me, are responsible for these hidden debts and for the financial debacle, generally speaking, they are now portrayed as the technocrats who will save the country. But they can't save the country because of conflict of interest.
So the debt that was hidden by the previous government under Macky Sall, who was in power until 2024, the IMF eventually approved a loan of 1.8 billion just before this debt was technically hidden. And then you have a lot of experts who are saying, experts, and I put in scare quotes, potentially how they have kind of legitimized the cyclical situation where a lot of African countries, particularly those who are in bed with the IMF, that tend to say it's impossible to get out of this cycle of debt without getting more loans, right? So one of these people is a former World Bank official and who writes extensively, John McIntyre. He writes that it's impossible to get out of the cycle. The only thing that needs to be done is more and more, working closely more with the IMF, the World Bank, and the French Treasury. He points out that the IMF runs the central bank. He points out that there are Senegalese and West African officials throughout these institutions. He says it's impossible that they did not know about this hidden debt. How do you respond to that? Is it really plausible that the IMF, which approved that loan, had no idea that the country debt was actually 50 percentage points higher than reported?
Well, there are only two things possible here: complicity or sheer incompetence. And I would say it's both. It's sheer incompetence and it's also complicity, because people themselves don't have any insider information, and we are, able to predict that we'll have a debt crisis because the external debt trajectory was simply not sustainable. You see, so the IMF has insider information. They have access to the central bank, they have access to the Minister of Economy, to the Minister of Finance, to the President, etc. So they have all the knowledge. But I think that they wanted to make sure that Macky Sall would stay in power. That's why when you read, for example, a blog, written by Dr. John McIntyre, former World Bank country director in Senegal, he said, for example, in 2023, something really shocking happened, because normally the IMF would not give a loan to any country without the IMF, providing the green light. But in the case of Senegal, the World Bank biggest loan come before any green light from the IMF. This is the, not the normal sequence you will see. And and the IMF has been saying that, the Senegal's, debt, profile is moderate, sustainable, etc. While people might, like myself, using very simple indicators, we say this is not sustainable at all. You see, so the IMF is a political body, and people should understand that. And you have just to look at the portfolio of loans of the IMF. The 6 major receivers of loans across the world are more or less countries that are client, to Western regimes. The first one is Argentina. Argentina represents something like more than 1/3 of all IMF loans. So if today we had a revolutionary government, in Argentina saying that we will not reimburse, the loans to the IMF would probably become bankrupt. You see, after Argentina, you have, Ukraine. And after Ukraine, you have countries like, Ecuador, Pakistan. And in Africa, the first one is Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire is, run by Ouattara. Ouattara used to be at the IMF. He used to be the governor of the central bank, not governor of the central bank, but he used to be at the central bank of West Africa, issuing the CFA franc. You see, and he was put to power by the French after they have bombarded, the palace of, Ivorian Palace to, get rid of Laurent Gbagbo. So it's the first country in terms of loans, extended by the IMF. So the IMF is a political body, and we have many, examples of countries having been fed with odious debts in order just, to keep in place client regimes. That's what happened in Senegal. And this should be clarified. That's why, people like myself are asking for an investigation at the IMF board over the responsibility of the IMF in what happened to Senegal. But we need also a citizen debt audit, internally in Senegal, to assess the situation, to define, what happened, what are the responsibilities, of, let's say, the Senegalese elites, the central bank, the French treasury, the IMF, World Bank, all of this. But this could be done only by the people, because the people have been cheated. And so when we talk about the citizen debt audit, that means we need parliamentary people, technical people, independent experts, but also representative, from civil society. We need that exercise of transparency.
And so when it comes to the intricacies that exist right now after this, political deadlock that is undertaken in Senegal, well, we have that moment of hope from 2024 elections, such that even, Senegal was even against, for example, the attacks that were taking place in Mali by Ukrainian mercenaries. And for example, the people were thinking that Senegal would be joining this bloc of countries that were largely anti-imperialist and anti-French, particularly Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. That now there's this democratically elected leader who is supporting that. But then when we had the Africa Forward Summit that was held place in Kenya, the very president who was very skeptical of the French imperialism and US imperialism attended it and shook hands with Emmanuel Macron and also the other puppets in Eastern Africa. And so it's kind of contradiction, is that there was a hope and then there's the shift afterwards, what happened. And so you have Sonko and then you have Faye, and right now there is a feud between them, and it is that stalemate. What are your speculation on the causes of that fissure that took place between them? Is it that Faye is under pressure of the IMF, or what exactly is taking place?
To be frank, I was not surprised by this scenario, because sometimes you have to learn from history in order to predict what could the future be. And in my own scenario, this split between the two would have happened. You know why? Because the principle is that international finance is against democracy, is against, sovereignty. We have to accept that first. Now, when you have a movement for sovereignty, because it's a popular movement for sovereignty, anti-imperialist movement, and at the same time, you are in a situation of debt crisis. This is an opportunity for international finance to kind of correct things, quote unquote, to say that we have to crush that movement and through, the debt crisis. That was, my own analysis. And I say they would use this debt crisis as an opportunity to crush the momentum towards, sovereignty, anti-imperialism, etc. So that's why when they appointed Al-Amin Lo, I said, yes, this is a signal in that direction. So I was not surprised, to be frank, because that's also what happened in Greece. And you could see many interesting parallels between Greece and the Syriza, at the head of the great financial crisis in Europe and what is happening in Senegal, you see. So I was making these parallels, you see. So this debt crisis is an opportunity for international finance to crush Senegal and any attempt, at anti-imperialism, sovereignty, etc. So at one point, people exploited, some divergences between the prime minister and the president, you see. And that's why the president went to Nairobi. And in Nairobi, it was a classical France-Africa summit. But what was interesting was that the managing director of the IMF was there, Christiana Georgieva. What would she do, in Nairobi, you see? So that means that the president has been trying to align himself with the IMF, the France, in order to have some political weight against Sonko, you see. And the IMF France has been using the debt crisis as an opportunity, to roll back this momentum towards, sovereignty, anti-imperialism, etc. You see, but the context is different. Is difficult for them. Why? Because there is this record of hidden debts. So that means that there's an opportunity for democracy in a truly substantive meaning, to say that if the people organize to ask for transparency, we could solve the debt crisis, because there is no technical solutions to the debt crisis, because this debt simply cannot be paid. It's impossible to pay this debt. When I say that, I make a distinction between the debt in domestic currency and debt in foreign currency. The debt in domestic currency, you could always manage if the central bank plays its role. But in foreign currency, you have to create, earning opportunities in foreign currency in order to repay. We don't have that earning capacity for now, because we don't own our oil and gas for now. You see, we have peanuts. We get more indebted by exploiting our oil and gas for now. You see, so there's nothing to accept on that side. And the only way we could reimburse the existing debt in foreign currency is by borrowing it again at higher rates. That's the definition of a debt that can be paid. That's why the only solution is for the people to assemble, to organize, to say, what is this debt situation? What is the debt situation? What are the odious parts? And we have to repudiate the odious parts, you see. And that's the exercise we need. Otherwise, there is no way. I always remember to people, because in Senegal there are many people saying that, oh, PASTEF has the solution. PASTEF is a political party of Sonko. They have the solution. So more tax collection, etc. They could solve the situation. They don't understand that the tax in domestic currency can't pay debt in foreign currency, because debt in foreign currency is always paid in foreign currency. You need to have the export income or get the financing from abroad. It's not yet taxing more your citizen that will provide you the money you need to pay your debt, you see. And so some of them are under the illusion that, through self-imposed austerity, you could, change the situation. I always make them remember that Haiti paid an odious debt for 122 years, 1825 to 1947, you see. So odious debt should not be paid. They should be repudiated. And you need political courage for that. And you need the people for that. Because those who created this debt crisis, they are now being portrayed as neutral technocrats who could save us. They can't save us.
Well, I think that requires a spirit of Pan-Africanism. And I think it's very ironic that during the summit, the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi in May 26, Emmanuel Macron declared at the summit, "We are the true Pan-Africanists." Right, so imagine a French person saying to African audience that him being there, that they are the true Pan-Africanists, right? He then proceeded to storm the stage uninvited to scold an African audience for what he called a total lack of respect. So he's right now on the African continent telling Africans that they have a total lack of respect for the summit. So critics pointed out that Pan-Africanism is rooted in struggles against colonialism, slavery, racial domination, and imperialism. Everything France spent centuries saying yes to. Actually, France committed the most horrendous acts across the African continent, continues to do so. And one could just keep going on and on and on about naming the legacy of French colonialism on the African continent, also elsewhere. We can also talk about Haiti, what's happening there. That's part of the anti-imperialist struggle there. So I have to ask you this. So he said that Emmanuel Macron, the president, a country that requires West African CFA countries to deposit half of their reserves in the French treasury, he stood and he said that, right? So the irony is too much. What do you make of that? And how does it connect to the financial architecture you're advocating for it to be changed?
You see, Emmanuel Macron, he was always try to hide beyond the fact that he was born after the period of formal colonialism. He say, oh, I have no complex, so I could talk freely to Africans. But in fact, he might be young, but he's a protege of the colonialists because he has no respect for Africans. He made several times, comments that are disparaging for Africans. He criticized, African women, saying that they have too many children, etc. When he went to Burkina Faso, he touched the cheek, of the president of Burkina Faso as if it was his child, you see. And one journalist asked him, would you ever touch the cheeks of Miss Angela Merkel? You see. And the last thing he did in Nairobi, is one of a long list, of racist behaviors from Emmanuel Macron, you see. But to be provocative, I would say that he's a Pan-Africanist because now they try to hijack the concept of Pan-Africanism, and he's not the first. He's unfortunately one of the latest to do that, because the European Union also is Pan-Africanist. And you see, they have a kind of a memorandum with the African Union, and it's called the Pan-Africanist Program. So the EU has a Pan-Africanist program with the African Union. So all of this are, Pan-Africanists. So imperialism has become Pan-Africanism. So that means that they are trying to hijack the concept the same way, some, commendable concepts have been hijacked, like democracy, freedom, etc. You see. So that's the same thing happening with Macron. Unfortunately, he was one of the latest because the European Union is already Pan-Africanist. So he's just, joining the bandwagon, I would say. You see. Yeah. But to be more serious, in fact, he said that there is this reform of the CFA franc in 2019. What is interesting, the day he made that announcement, it was December 21st, 2019. the day of his birthday. You see, he was in Abidjan and he wanted to have a gift for himself. And that day was the president of Cote d'Ivoire, Ouattara. They said, oh, the CFA franc will disappear and there will be no longer any obligation for the central bank to accumulate reserves at the French treasury and so on. And in July next year, 2020, you will have a new currency called the ECO. That's what they say. But what is interesting is that even the Central Bank of West Africa was not aware of that, that currency reform. They learn it as all Africans, on TV, you see. And what I'm saying now does not come from me. There have been an official French report by a French MP who said in his report the day Macron announced that, all of the people were shocked because they say, how could you announce a currency reform without the central bank being informed? No one was informed except for Macron and Ouattara at the time. But all those announcements at the time, there have been some economists saying that, oh, it's the end of the CFA franc. And I tweeted immediately saying, this is not the end of it because the CFA franc is not about symbols. It's a relationship of domination. And you could not, end that, with a decree or an announcement. But nothing happened. And because, they said that the reserves would not be accumulated at the French treasury. But that's not correct. Because indeed they closed the operation accounts. That means account in which there's the African the foreign currencies were held at 50%. You see, but now what they did, that was cash. Now they use the cash to buy bonds in euros, sovereign bonds in euros. So you could, surmise that they will buy French bonds. So that means in your left pocket you used to have some cash, but now you are no longer using that cash. You use that cash to buy bonds that will land on the right pocket of the French treasury. That's what they call reform. And they said, oh, we are going to rename the currency. As I said at the time, that's impossible because this is a legal matter. All the parliaments have to approve, changing the name, And this cannot be done in 6 months. In the case of the euro, for example, the delay between, let's say, the launch of the physical euro in coins, banknotes, and the scriptural euro was 3 years. The scriptural euro, electronic euro, was launched in 1999, but the scriptural euro was launched 3 years later, 2002. You see, so it was a pure bluff, but at the same time, they wanted, to kind of sabotage the currency project of West Africa, because West Africa, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has its distinct, monetary integration project, that dates back to 1983. And so they said, we would like to have a common currency for the 15 countries of ECOWAS, including aid using the CFA franc, that would name ECO. And ECO is short for ECOWAS. But Macron and Ouattara said, oh, the CFA will be named ECO, just to say that we don't care about your ECO project with Nigeria, Ghana, and all these countries. These countries should come to belong to the CFA franc zone, and the CFA franc zone will be now called the ECO zone. That was the announcement. But now, 70 years later, there's nothing. Status quo. You see, we still have the CFA franc. And and the CFA franc, as I said, has been used to organize a kind of a financial embargo, domestic embargo, against Mali and against Niger.
Right. Well, I've read a lot of your work, and one of the papers that were passed on because of my involvement with some organizations is that what you call the Continental Monetary Authority, managed by central banks, and it's kind of like a Pan-African unit of account for settling intra-African trade, not circulating currency. And it would require pooling of external assets. The continent's combined foreign exchange reserves, currently about 450 billion or so. Swap lines with BRICS countries, or BRIC, because South Africa would also be involved in this. And this would allow African countries to trade with each other without using dollars or euros. Because, I think it's sometimes sad, like, I'm from Libya and I want to trade with Tunisia, and Tunisia would say, oh, don't trade with our local currencies, let's use US dollars or euros. And especially to our proximity to European markets, they say euros are better. And so Libyans, in order to buy our neighbors' products, we would be required to find hard currency. And so what is it that we need to do in order to get hard currency? We need to extract something and give it to the markets that are international markets dominated by those currencies, largely oil or natural resources. And that's the only way that we can eventually start to do the delinking. So your proposal is fundamentally about changing the rules of the game. It's about African countries taking power of their own financial destiny. But Senegal's crisis shows how deeply embedded the current system is. The CFA franc, the IMF, the French Treasury, the debt traps. And in 2011 also, Libya was destroyed, particularly for that reason, right? Sarkozy went full-fledged into destruction of Libya because Libya was advocating for a financial delinking and creating an alternative currency to offset the influence of the CFA franc in Africa. And this is not just propaganda or anything like that. It's all in the emails of Hillary Clinton with her.
Yes.
So if you were advising any president or even Senegal's president today, because at some point you were also an advisor, what would you tell him to do, and how realistic is it to expect any African leader to break from the system when the consequences of doing so can be political destruction or invasion or just larger imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough question, but I will start by saying that it's possible to financially delink. I mean, I will be happy the day when African people will stop about asking where do we find the financing, because that is the most trivial question. It is very easy to finance everything that we could do ourselves, and everything that we need, at the continent and also individual nations. That's why, I think we need to organize our financial delinking despite all the external pressure we might face. And that is possible. We just need political courage and solidarity between African nations, willing African nations. I am not opposed to a single currency for the continent, but simply I don't think this is realistic in the short and medium term. And let's suppose that we would have that. It would require a number of very stringent conditions for the single currency to be successful. The Eurozone has not been successful for European people because it was not designed for European people, but for international finance, you see. So we would have a single currency that is not for your people, but for, international finance. And the current monetary project we have within the continent are not for the African people, are not for Pan-Africanism. It is for international finance. That's why I oppose them. The ECOWAS currency, the African Union single currency, all of this is not for Africans. It is like in colonial times, because in colonial times, you also had single currencies. You had the franc zone, the selling zone, President zone, everything. These were not for African people. And the same thing we have today with the projects we have. So realistically, how can we do in full sovereignty in order to organize our financial delinking? We should start by saying that we don't need to get rid of our national currency. But we have to have a Pan-African unit of account that will help, settle our trade within each other. Why would Senegal trade with Ghana or Kenya, in US dollar or British pound? Why would Senegal trade, with South Africa in US dollar? That's not necessary at all. We just need to have our own Pan-African unit of account issued by a continental monetary authority so that all the trade within Africa will be settled by that authority. We know that the trade within Africa is a very small share of our overall trade. The other question that will be asked is how are we going to settle for the external trade? You see, and that's not also too difficult because if we centralize all our assets, external assets, I mean the foreign exchange we have, US dollar, euros, the standard drawing rights we have at the IMF, our monetary gold, all of these things. You see, if we centralize that, we have a kind of a chess war, in terms of foreign exchange equivalent to Saudi Arabia. You see, that's something like 500 billion USD. And Libya will be very critical in that end because Libya alone commands something like 90 billion US dollar of external assets. You see, so whenever we do that, what will happen is that all the countries, when they have to import, they will just pay in their own currency, and that the payment ultimately will be settled by the Continental Monetary Authority. You see, and that means that the cost of any foreign debt will be lower for the African nations individually and also collectively, because the unfortunate thing in this current unjust international financial system is that when we accumulate assets, like for our foreign exchange, we have very poor returns, very, very poor. And when we issue debt in foreign currency, we are subject to very high, interest rate, very high yields. Now, when you centralize all of these things, you are less subject, to this kind of mismatch with, poor returns and, high yields for your liabilities. You see, and the thing is also, as you said, we could have swap lines with big countries like China, Russia, etc., so that you don't need to accumulate US dollar or euros or any other currency in order to trade, externally speaking. So this would be the advantage of Pan-Africanism. Now, regarding the Senegal situation, as I said, there is no technical solution. There are only one solution, a democratic one. That means full transparency. You involve the people, citizen debt audit, and while we do the citizen debt audit, we freeze the payments, the service payments to all debts that are, suspected of being or just subject to the preservation of the financial stability of the domestic banking system. Because if some banks are heavily exposed to the hidden debts, if you default, you could put them in a very difficult situation, and ultimately you could put your the depositors in a very difficult situation. So that would only be the caveat. But except for that, we have to freeze the payments of the debts that are suspected of being odious, and this would free also significant policy space. And because when you have your people behind, there are limits to how far the imperial system could go. And Senegal, it's not only Senegal that should do that, but most of these African countries, they are in situation of odious or semi-odious debt. What I would call semi-odious debt is sometimes you take the case of Senegal. We have taken loans to finance infrastructure projects, but those infrastructure projects responded to demand coming from, let's say, some French companies, but not necessarily demands coming from the Senegalese populations. So people will invest billions of US dollars for infrastructure benefiting, some French companies, but those $billions could have been used differently to benefit the Senegalese populations, and those choices have not been made. So we need a complete democratic, scrutiny on all of these loans, all of these projects, so as to ascertain which part is odious and which part is not. And that is possible. That is really possible. But I think, as you said, we need Pan-Africanism. We need solidarity between African countries. And we need also a common defense pact, because that has been also very important in the case of the Saharan countries. We should remove all military bases for sure. All, foreign military bases, troops, and have a concerted, Pan-Africanist, security doctrine. We need that. That is also, very important for the sovereignty of the continent.
Right, yeah, and I think you highlighted one key thing from the late Samir Amin when he says that imperialism walks on two legs. One is the financial and the other one is military. And you cannot fight imperialism with one. And I think the example of Iran recently really shows that despite they have been hit hard economically and also through war, but they were able to resist because of how they created an economy of around their sanctions. They cushioned a war economy, right? And they cushioned themselves to protect themselves from this imperialist onslaught that has taken place since the beginning of, June last year, I think. But I think we're just going to have to maybe take a step back and ask you a follow-up question about, in a simplified way. Most people think is that when somebody makes an international transaction, meaning like, let's say Libya wants to buy something from France, is that there's a Libyan person with a suitcase with money and transfer the money there, right? Which isn't, it doesn't work like that. So that's why even sanctions, they wouldn't prevent that particular person from traveling with that suitcase with that money. It's about all these numbers and monies that are codes that get transacted between banks, and then that really indicate that money has traveled. So how would that look like in the African continent when you say we should be trading instead of, let's say, Ghana with Cote d'Ivoire or Senegal with Mali or whatever? They are trading with something that what you have articulated, which is the CMA, the Continental Monetary Alliance, I think.
Authority, yeah.
Authority, sorry, yeah. So how would that look like in a very simplified way, as opposed to printing money and paying things? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for this question. But before I forget it, I would like, to really thank Professor Horace Campbell, because on these subjects about financial delinking, we have been exchanging a lot, and I benefited a lot from his insights, you see, because we have been having this conversation for years now, you see. The first thing to say is that money never moves. The people could be shocked by hearing that. No US dollar could ever leave the US banking system. That's impossible. Now, the coins, the banknotes, they circulate freely across borders. That's for sure. But most of the money, 95% at least of the money, is in electronic form. That means entries, numbers in banks' balance sheets. That's how money is. So no US dollar could ever penetrate, let's say, Senegal or Libya extra. That's impossible. You see. So that means that when you accumulate things in US dollar, somehow you're contributing to the US economy to some extent, not your own economy. So let's say Libya has 90 billion USD of external assets. Those external assets are external. They are not in Libya. So at any point, they could seize it, because this is called fiat currency.
And they
Gaddafi yes.
Yeah.
And Gaddafi,
sorry to interrupt you, but there are $200 billion frozen outside of Libya, in Africa and elsewhere. But yeah, just to show that never trust US dollar. Yeah.
Yes, and this is fiat currency. And Gaddafi understood that. That's why at one point he was saying, I don't want your US dollars. I want to convert them as gold, because gold is something real. I could control it. You see. But when you accumulate US dollar or euros, it's just numbers in computers. And every time they could give the order, no transfer anymore. And that's how sanctions happen, you see, electronically speaking. Now, if we have our Pan-African, financial system, we'll have, a unit of account, continental unit of account that will help settle the trades between the countries. That means that all the countries, let's say Libya, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa, they will have an account, in the, let's say, Pan-African unit of account. Let's call it Afro, for example. And the Continental Monetary Authority would be, the depository of all these accounts. So you'll have, let's say, 54 states, African states, and all those 54 African states, they would have their account in the Pan-African unit of account, and they will have credit there. And whenever there are a transaction between countries, the settlement will be made, the clearing will be made at the continental level. So you don't need to accumulate any euro, any dollar to do that. It will not be a currency like the euro or US. It will be just a unit of account. It's a unit to measure countries owe each other, and that's it. And the interesting thing is that the African Union has this project in 1963, but killed. And that's the thing. We need to have a continental payment union. We need that sovereignty individually and collectively. And this is something we could do in a few years, very few years, you see. And from there, you need no longer the US, the World Bank. You no longer need the IMF. Because what people have to understand is that money is not something scarce. Money is just, an electronic entry. That means that the banks have been given the role to create the money, because most of the money are created by banks in the modern world, in all countries. So let's say we give the banks the power to create money. And at the same time, we say to our states, we don't like you to create the money. But the state is the originator of money. So that means that all states could always create the money needed to finance things they could do. You see, recently we worked with two colleagues, Andrea Carrera and Alvaro Senchini. This body of theory is called counter macroeconomics. And there is a kind of reform that any country could do, or group of country, that will protect it from the vulnerabilities of the external system. You see, for example, currency volatility. We could get rid of currency volatility. You see, you could turn your external deficits into an advantage for you, because, for example, in the current system, we did the calculation for Senegal. Senegal, for example, had an external deficit of 7 billion USD, in 2023. That means that we bought abroad 7 billion more than we received from abroad. And so the 7 billion is a debt, owed to the rest of the world. And now using this current system, you pay this debt twice, because you bought 7 billion to buy more than you have. And that means that you pledge to pay 7 billion plus interest in the coming years. That will be taken on your production. But at the same time, the domestic counterpart of the 7 billion will be lost to the national economy. That's how this system works. Now you could put a reform at the country level or group of country, so that the domestic counterpart of the 7 billion will not be lost to the economy. In the case of Senegal, is more than 4,000, billion CFA franc. It's the size of the budget of Senegal. So for 1 year, you could have that. So that means that for now, we have the knowledge to change things in a way that will make our countries financially independent, no longer dependent on the IMF, on the Western financial institutions. That's possible. But the only thing that is missing is the political will, and also the work of political education needed for people to understand what money is, how money works, what are the peculiarities of the international finance system. Once people understand that, they will understand that the easiest thing to do is to find the financing to finance everything that is needed for your own development. Finance could never be a constraint if you understand how things work. You see. But that has been a gap, in our strategies, because every time we used to have strategies that is based on a wrong understanding of money, even from the anti-imperialist people, the progressive movements. The understanding of money is really, really not adequate. So we have to understand what money is, and from there we could see all the possibilities, economic possibilities we have. But money could never be the constraint.
I see. Yeah, and I think this is why I started actually following your work and IDEA or ideas, because you have been highlighting understanding the processes of delinking is not just go and fight imperialism with the sticks and stones, or it's not just writing ideologically, but it's also somehow financially how to circumvent this system through legal means, but also through other expertise. So I know that you have spoken with a lot of passion and hope, but we at the same time we are seeing an increasing attacks on the African continent in different forms: military, ideological, financial sanctions. They have been exacerbating throughout these years. So what gives you hope that right now, when we're talking and teaching and speaking about imperialism, how it operates, that we are taking one step in the right directions against imperialism, to rise up against neocolonialism of French. What are your last kind of remarks of hope going forward?
Well, I would say that Western imperialism has never been so weak, historically speaking. When I say that, this could be surprising, but whenever you have a kind of a burst of extreme violence, it's also a sign that something is wrong, because they no longer have, the monopoly in a number of, areas, technologically speaking, military speaking, as Iran demonstrated, in terms of communication, etc. So Western imperialism has never been so weak. That's why it is so violent, because it's a kind of terminal phase. But now it's up to the people to organize, because we have to liberate from imperialism. But to liberate ourselves from imperialism, we have also to liberate ourselves from, the local allies of imperialism, because in many countries, they are the obstacles to true liberation. So people have to organize, locally, in order to change the system, because we have openings here. And what has been happening, with the war on Iran is really significant for most of us. You have to be ready for that. And I think in the case of Africa, as we said, we have to host, foreign troops, military bases ASAP. And we have to make sure, in a matter of 2 years, to build, our financial infrastructure in order, to claim our monetary and financial sovereignty. Because if you don't have monetary and financial sovereignty, you will still be dependent on other areas, and it's really, not too difficult to reclaim your monetary and financial sovereignty, especially if you do also efforts to control your own resources, because ultimately it's about real resources. imperialist countries, they will never say that they lack the money. They will say, oh, we need lithium from Bolivia. We need coltan from DR Congo. That's how they map things. They will never say we lack the money. So we should learn from them and say that, no, we know that we don't lack the money, but we have to control our resources and develop the capability to exploit our own, resources, in a Pan-Africanist spirit. And I think that is possible. So that all of this makes me hopeful, despite the difficult challenges we have, at many levels, socially, from the climate perspective, economically, it's very, very tough. But we have to make sure that we have, audacious thinking, and also be bold in our commitment to change things.
Very powerful, very strong. Thank you so much, Sylla. No, truly, this has been very eye-opening, and I'm sure it will be also eye-opening to our listeners and viewers. As the events develop in Africa, particularly in the western part related to Senegal, I'll keep an eye on what you have been writing and what you will be writing in the future. And I'll also share your writings in the description of the channel. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.